Morning and welcome, and thanks so much for joining us on this long weekend. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube because you're camping this weekend, haha, the weather stinks. Um, sometimes I shouldn't. I should act my age as opposed to what age I think I am. We're going to continue on a series on the book of Ecclesiastes. I've called this series Paradox because, as we kind of have been defining the term paradox, paradox has this idea that two opposite ideas or two opposite concepts can actually be in alignment. So the definition of the word paradox is a statement or situation that may be true but seems impossible or difficult to understand because it contains two opposite facts or characteristics. Or a statement that is seemingly contradictory or opposed to common sense and yet is perhaps true. The book of Ecclesiastes has really, for thousands of years, has messed up Western readers. Because for often, the book of Ecclesiastes says a lot of different things that we look at as Christians and go, wait, are you saying we should do that? Are you saying that my life is meaningless? Like, what's going on here? And again, I think the importance of the Ecclesiastes is going to become apparent as we kind of continue to move through it and get towards the end of it. But what's interesting about Ecclesiastes, at least for me, as I've been studying it, our culture is looking for meaning in different ways, of course. We're looking for ways to say, okay, this is what is true, this is what is not as true. But the thing is, though, is these statements we make, even as Christ followers, I'm not sure we can make these statements about what we think gives meaning or what we think is true. Last week we looked at, of course, the next part of the first part of chapter 1, where the most famous phrase of a book of Ecclesiastes is, everything is meaningless, says a teacher, completely meaningless. Or, vanity of vanities, says a preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now, the idea behind the word vanity in the Hebrew is temporary, vapor. Your breath goes out, it's gone. That's what he says meaning is. And we looked at the 3 points of this. We said that meaning is an anchor point. And what's interesting about meaning as an anchor point is you have to be careful where you put it. So we looked at that image of that climber who is literally dangling hundreds of feet in the air off one piece of rope anchored to the wall. Right? And I said meaning is an anchor point. Just be careful what you're anchoring your meaning to. And this is what's interesting, is it because if we anchor meaning to a person, a politician, a political party, a church, a preacher, an influencer, just go on with the list, right? If we anchor our meaning to those individuals will always let us down. And that meaning will then become like, wait, I don't know. So oftentimes we'll see things like a catastrophe, a natural disaster, some sort of like human-made catastrophe, and or a famous preacher, teacher, celebrity who is caught in some sort of scandal. What's going on? Can I believe this? Can I trust this? And again, what is really revealing is that we actually placed a little bit too much meaning on this individual, on this institution. We talk about this idea of temporary. Everything is temporary. And again, I can't emphasize that enough to you. A lot of the things we think are permanent, a lot of things we think are always going to be there, are not. I had a conversation with an individual, and they were talking about how important their friends are in school. I said, just so you know, fun fact. When you graduate, 95% of the people you think are so important right now, you'll never see again, ever. So the decisions you make, the things you think are so important, the type of peer pressure you feel, or the things you think you should do, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And finally, the last thing is, be careful where you get your meaning from. And of course, that will be a continual theme throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And I gave you Pastor Raja's version of this phrase. Everything is temporary, says Koheleth Raja, completely temporary. Now remember, that phrase Koheleth means preacher, teacher, or one who assembles. Everything is temporary. Everything is temporary. And again, as Christ followers, we have to always understand that no matter what we think is permanent, what we think is a foundation by which we live upon, everything is temporary. Well, this morning we're going to jump up. We're going to take a look at the second part of chapter 1. But before we do that, let's talk about a phrase that is quite popular amongst millennials, or Gen X, Gen Zers as well too. And the phrase is adulting. So Kathy Steinmetz wrote an article about this. I want to talk a little bit about what this is and why I find this so fascinating. She says this in her article. English speakers love to turn nouns into verbs. There was rain before it rained. There was Google before we Googled. And there were adults before we adulted. The latter has exploded on the internet in the past year. In fact, the American Dialect Society, the organization that basically invented choosing a word of the year, by the way, a couple years ago, the word of the year was Riz, which apparently, according to people, I have lots of, nominated the verb adult as last year's most creative in construction and the most recent vote a few months ago. So what's happened is this word adult has become a verb, adulting. So what does it mean? Great question. According to Jane Solomon, a lexicographer at dictionary.com and one of the article's authors, a big factor is millennials and their delayed development, which isn't necessarily as unfortunate as it sounds. So what you find out with this idea of adulting is there is a young cohort of people who believe that they should have a certain amount of knowledge when they reach an age. So when you're 20, you should know how to change a tire. When you're 25, maybe brakes might be the next, or an oil change, or all. There's just different things. There are different parts of our lives we think, you know what? When I get to this age, I should know how to do my taxes. Or I should know how to, wire a light or something like that, right? These are ideas, right? So what's happening, though, is our younger cohorts of people are now no longer being taught this or understand how to do this, so they have this delayed part, right? So adulting is where they come up to it, right? So when they have some sort of responsibility thrown on their shoulders, oh, I'm having a horrible day. I'm adulting all day long. And actually, it was funny, in my other job, I was talking to a 20-something. I said, you know how you know you're an adult? And of course, their eyes perk up. I said, here's how you know you're an adult. When something gets canceled and you're actually happy. I said, that's your first indicator that you might be an adult. It's like, oh, this meeting got canceled or this got canceled, and now I have free time. Oh, this is so great. That's how you know you're an adult, right? So adulting is this idea that we should know these things. We should have this knowledge of how to do this thing, but somehow we don't. This generation of millennials, she says, they go through life stages that the other generations have gone through much later in life, like starting families, owning homes. Maybe they don't own homes at all. The age of first-time mothers is indeed at a historic high of 26. Real estate site Zillow found that first-time home buyers are more likely to be older and single today than in past decades. We've all heard of millennials boomeranging. Boomeranging means they move out of the house, but then they move back into the house, right? So, as parents, you're like, your kids leave, you're like, ooh, I'm going to make that room into, and then they come back. You're like, okay, I'm not going to make it into anything. Goes on to say this. And this is, by the way, the author, Kelly Williams Brown. She wrote the book Adulting. And she's a person who kind of really put this out there. And this is what she says in her interview. I was sitting in a bar with a much older friend of mine. She was in her 50s, and I was in my mid-20s. I was talking to her about this idea I had for a book. How it should have all these things that you need to learn before you're 30. Like, how do you change a tire and all that stuff in one compendium? And that's true, right? There are parts of knowledge we should have. We just don't seem to. And it's like, wait, I thought as an adult, and I don't know, I remember when I was younger, I thought all adults knew these things. And then I get there and I realize, oh no, adults can be morons too. Oh, look at that, it's not fun. That's a fun fact, I didn't know that. Okay, good. But the point is that adulting is this idea that we acquire knowledge at certain points of our lives. So the question I'm going to ask you this morning, every so often I'll do this, and I did this yesterday on our Instagram and Facebook page, is I asked this question: are you smart or are you wise? And the secondary question I had yesterday was, what's the difference? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, and we're going to start off at verse 12, and we're going to finish off the chapter. And of course, get your electronic devices, whatever you want, but we're going to start off here. This morning, we're going to start with the book of Ecclesiastes, then we're going to pivot, because we have to take a look at the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, because he will also help us to understand this book. So let's just jump in. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12 to 14. I, the teacher, was king of Israel, and I lived in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to search for understanding and explore by wisdom everything being done under heaven. I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. Again, this guy should write greeting cards or birthday cards, right? Happy birthday, it's all meaningless anyways, who cares, right? I didn't get you a cake or a present. But the point is this, is that he's not wrong, but he might be, but how? I love this one part he says there, where he says that God has dealt a tragic existence. I pause on that because I've heard that in a variety of forms all over. Life's not fair. This shouldn't happen. This is what God should have done. I'm a Christ follower, therefore I should be exempt from these types of pain, this type of suffering, this type of tragedy. That shouldn't be part of my life. So sometimes we will attribute to God things that we think are negative. We go, well, it's God's fault. And I would say King Solomon might be doing the same thing as well too. He says, I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. Now, just as a fun fact, we're not going to answer that question today because it's not really where we're going to go with it. But we will have to answer this question because this is a question that demands an answer. And I know a lot of ex-Christians, ex-evangelicals, I used to go to church, I used to believe in God. A lot of people have this idea as well too. If God loved me, if God cared about me, then why didn't he answer this prayer? Why didn't he provide this? Why isn't this in my life, right? And again, adulting, or might be this idea of maturing. In verse 15, he throws another phrase in there, which I'm going to show you what it really means because there's a bit of a deeper understanding to it. He says this, what is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. By the way, that's tattoo worthy. I don't know about you, but like that's a great phrase. But what does he mean by that? Now, the New King James Version says it this way. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be numbered. Now, the reason he throws this out there, he just says that God has given humanity a tragic existence. We're kind of going, okay. Now, and then he follows up with this phrase here. Now, this is what it actually means, and I want to kind of explain to you. By way of definition, the Hebrew word translated crooked, abath, is used less than a dozen times in the rest of the Old Testament. Its basic meaning is to wrest, which is to forcibly pull something from a person's grasp, or to obtain by wrenching with violent, twisting movements. In essence, it is the assertion of one person's will against another, and the result is damage that can never truly be repaired. Pause for a second. So, in one breath, he says, God has dealt humanity a tragic existence. In this next phrase, he says, you know what? Humans kind of really mess with other humans as well, too. David Grabb in his commentary said this, Solomon's saying that once the natural order of things has been upset by this willfulness, it is essentially impossible to make those things right again. The order of things cannot be equalized, which is what word would translate as straight means. Even though there may be a salve that can be applied when something has been wrested from another, when one person's will has been asserted at the expense of someone else's, it sets things into motion that cannot be equalized. A measure of crookedness always remains in a man's works. You know this in relationships. You know this in life. We all bear scars of past hurts and pains. And it doesn't matter about the apology. It doesn't matter about the time. It's still there. But what I love about this idea is what Solomon's saying, what King Solomon is saying is, you know what? Not only does God kind of give human beings the short end of the stick as far as our life goes, but humans do that to each other, right? Humans do that. So when we look at the world today and we say to ourselves, well, look at all the problems in the world today. Why doesn't God help the hungry? Why is there violence over here? Why is this happening? And the reality is it's not God at all. It's just human beings, right? In order for someone to be rich, somebody has to be poor. In order for someone to have a lot, somebody has to have less. Right? That's just the way things are because we don't have infinite resources. We have limited amount of resources. Therefore, some people will get something, other people will not get something. And so what Solomon's saying here is actually kind of important because he's not just saying to God, you know what, by the way, God, you kind of given me the short end of the stick there. He's also saying too that, we as human beings, we do this to ourselves. Verse 16 to 17. I said to myself, look, I am wiser than any of the kings who ruled in Jerusalem before me. By the way, there's only one other king before him, so it's kind of a, small sample size. But I'm not going to give that to him. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. So I set out to learn everything from wisdom to madness and to folly. By the way, wisdom, madness, and folly. Just remember that in the next couple of weeks when we're talking about that, because those are three levels he's going to kind of go through into this. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all this is like chasing the wind. And the final part of verse 1, he says this in verse 18. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. Now, it's an interesting thing, right? So in chapter 1, he starts off with meaningless. He kind of parts apart, but he ends it off with this. He says, by the way, get as smart as you want, but just so you know, there's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid for all of this. Because when you look at the world as it actually is, when you see the things that they actually are, it's kind of depressing a little bit. You're kind of going, like, what's the deal of it? What's the worth of it? Now, this brings us to the end of chapter 1. But what's interesting about this is I think it's important to look at the man himself, because King Solomon, I think he has a good publicist, because I think he's seen as wise, but is he really as wise as he claims? And this is important. So let's take a look at our Bibles. We're going to kind of go back and forth here a little bit, but I want to show you the story of King Solomon's life. I want to give you a brief biblical biography on him, because I think it's important to understand who he is, because when you understand who he is, you understand why he says what he does. Now, a quick note here. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 20 to 30, it says this: King David responded, "Call Bathsheba." So she came back in and stood before the king. And the king repeated his vow, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has rescued me from every danger, your son Solomon will be the next king and will sit on my throne this very day, just as I vowed to you before the Lord, the God of Israel." Now, the reason I bring this up to you, Bathsheba's your mother. Yeah, she might be one of the most famous women in the Bible for probably all the wrong reasons. But remember, her story is in the book of Psalms. Everybody knows, right? There is no, Bathsheba, you remember this? Remember David killed her husband, and, he slept with her, and first son died, right? All of this is known by the people. And the reason I throw this out there is I wonder if Solomon had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Because, again, Bathsheba was somebody who was very notorious to the people of Israel. That's his mom. That, I think, is going to color some of his opinions. I think that's going to probably affect how he looks at the world. And I think rightfully so, right? Rightfully so. So that's his origins. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 3 says this: Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David, except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at local places of worship. Now, why this is important, why the writer puts this at the very beginning of King Solomon's career, is because he's going to have this meteoric rise in regards to what he's going to do for Israel. But this little piece here is important because this is going to affect how the story ends. Okay? So again, kind of important. Now, verse 4, a very famous story of King Solomon. That night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream. And God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I'll give it to you." By the way, this is the equivalent of getting a lottery ticket. Everyone else says, "Hey, what do you want in your life?" "Oh, I just need $10 million. Okay, here's $10 million. Now what do you want to do with it? I don't know. I have never thought of it, right? God appears to King Solomon and says, "Okay, what do you want?" This is the equivalent of a biblical lottery ticket. Because God has said, whatever you ask, I'll give it to you. Now, Solomon, in verse 7 to 9, says this: "Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I am like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" Best answer ever. Right? Best answer ever. And again, I don't know about politicians or leaders, but this is how you really kind of mitigate power. Right? When we think about leadership today, what we're really thinking about is how do we kind of make sure that those who are in power, those who have authority, are actually using it wisely. Right? And so in the political system, we have all these checks and balances. Right? This individual can't do this without the ratification of these group of people here. And again, I think that's a great idea. Right? And so in all of this, there's this idea of saying, okay, when you give someone power, when you give somebody authority, when you give someone a position, how do they respond? I always think it's funny. Have you ever gone to any event? There's always the windbreaker people. Right? The windbreaker people are the people who kind of control the event. They have security on their back, right? And the reality is, I just feel like they give these to everybody. Right? They just give this windbreaker to anybody. Because you get there, and these individuals who've never had authority in their entire life are now the authority. And some wield it well, but most do not. Right? So, as an example, one time my wife and I were at a concert, and of course in any kind of concert, As you would expect, there are no washrooms. And we had been waiting in line for several hours, about 12 in total. And of course, you're in line, you're dehydrated, it's hot, it's a summer day. So, of course, we're drinking water, right? And then they say, oh, the people let them in. And of course, if you've ever been to a general admission concert, when you get through the door, you run, right? I don't even wait for my wife, right? I am running. And by the way, she tells me not to wait for her either. She says, get the best spot, I'll catch up to you. Now, please understand, I don't have long legs, I'm not fleet of foot, but I'm faster than her. That's all you need to know, right? I'm faster than her. So I get to the front, and I get a great spot, and she finally catches up, and she kind of, and people are looking at her like, oh, that's my husband. The brown one, really? Yeah. Okay, all right, fine. So she stands next to me. So now the concert's supposed to start, right? The concert's supposed to start. I think it's like 4 o'clock, and the concert's supposed to start at like 8 o'clock, right? There's the opening act, and, the real act doesn't get on until like 9 o'clock. But of course, by that time, my bladder is starting to kind of remind me that I have it. And it's like, oh, okay. And like, it's standing room. There's nowhere to sit. You're standing room. You're on the rail, right? You're like this. So I go, okay, sweetheart, I got to use the washroom. She's like, what? I'm like, you could have gone before. I'm like, where? I ask you, where? I implore you, right? So I had to go back and I say, hey, I was saying this to people as I'm walking back, remember me. I'll be back this way again. Just know I'll be back again, right? So I get to the back. I get to the door, and the security person, right, the windbreaker person, I said, listen, I just need to use the washroom. I'll be right back. Please remember me. I'm going to get through here. Oh, yeah, no problem. Great. Go to the washroom. Again, line up, no problem. Get back. It's a different windbreaker person. I don't know what happened. The person left their post. I was only like 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh, hey, I'm just going to, like, no. I'm like, no, here's my ticket. I have general. I'm like, well, I just have to, I'm like, it says general admission. It says the venue. It says the date. How could this be made up? I'm like, I'm just going to go in. And like, well, we just have to, I'm like, okay. Now, the point is, this person kept me there for 20 minutes. Like, you would have swore I was going through the, an airport. They wanted to scan everything. I'm in shorts and a t-shirt with like Birkenstocks on, okay? I don't have any place to put anything. What do you want from me right now, right? And I said, just get your colleague. Oh, what is my colleague? I don't know. They had a windbreaker on too. They're giving these out by the dozens. Find that person because they can let me. They know. And anyways, the point is this. I know that's a long story. By the way, it's still hurtful for me. My therapist really hears that story every time. The point is, power is something that is given, but do you use it? Now, you know this as well, too, from a teacher or from a boss, right? A great boss is somebody who doesn't wield that bossness and is bossy. A bad boss, oh, we've all had those, right? Teachers as well and whatever, people of authority. So when King Solomon asks for this, it tells us something about him. Now, I showed you just a couple of verses ago that who's his mother? Bathsheba. He didn't come from a lineage that would be like, So because of that, I think there is a bit of humility in him. So when he's finally placed in this position, he realizes something. My mom's Bathsheba. Everyone knows who she is. And they know that I am, the son of, and they know the starting of my parents. So I think there's this humility in him. So when he asks this is a fantastic ask. Now watch this. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, by the way, that's kind of a cool ask, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will have. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And, this is important, this two-letter word is the downfall of many people. If you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands as your father David did, I will give you a long life. The two-letter word if is really important. See, what's interesting about this is God says, I will do this for you. But this is not unconditional. This is not, hey, here's a blank check. Live how you want, be how you want. That's important. And again, the writer puts this in here because we're going to see this in a second with what's happened here. So, fast forward, chapter 11, verse 1 to 3. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women, Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from other Hittites, and among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. By the way, that's a horrifying number of 1,000 women. 1,000 women to make happy? I've got 3 daughters. I got a wife. And a female dog. I don't think I'm even doing that one, right? I can't even do that, right? But 1,000, right? But what's important here, and this is really key, is it's not so much how many women he has. Which, by the way, it's just a little fun fact for you. Something some people don't realize is the kings were only supposed to have one wife as well. The multiple wives, by the way, was not okay by God. The kings were supposed to adhere to these rules as well. In Solomon's old age, they turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshipped Ashereth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. Remember, Moloch is the guy that wants to sacrifice your firstborn to them. Horrific, right? In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the eye and the Lord's sight. He refused to follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. So, this is a real big shift from, Lord, I don't know what I'm doing, I just need wisdom, to 1,000 women. It's a big shift. What happened? Right, what happened? It's a great question. We'll get to it. Verse 9 to 13. The Lord was very angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. It's important, right? It's important to understand that God appears to him twice, because that's 2 times more than any of us have ever seen God. He had warned Solomon specifically about worshiping other gods, but Solomon did not listen to the Lord's command. So now the Lord said to him, since you have not kept my covenant and have disobeyed my decrees, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. But for the sake of your father David, I will not do this while you are still alive. I will take the kingdom away from your son. And even so, I will not take away the entire kingdom. I will let him be the king of one tribe for the sake of my servant David, for the sake of Jerusalem, my chosen city. This is King Solomon. This is the book that we're going to study, but this is the person who writes the book. Now, the reason I want to digress to kind of show you a little bit of his character is because as often as many leaders, they start off well, especially if they come from grassroots. They don't come from positions of authority and power, right? We know that people who are in authority and power and get authority from parents or whatever, those individuals, they're used to authority, and that's never probably a good thing. King Solomon came from his mother Bathsheba, and I wanted to show that to you because, again, that's going to be in the back of his mind. So when God appears to him at the very beginning of his reign, the thing that's most upon his heart is that he doesn't know what he's doing. And so he says, God, I need wisdom because I really don't know what I'm doing. And God says, absolutely, because you've asked for this and not everything else. And by the way, death of your enemies, I'm going to give you everything else. And King Solomon says, excellent. But what happens with power is that as you have it a little bit longer and longer and longer, you kind of forget what it's like not to have it. And you believe then you are entitled to it, and that you believe now it's your right to have it. What's interesting, and I wanted to go off on the tangent, and I didn't, but I just wanted to say something to you about how the Jewish political system worked, right? So there are 3 people in the political system of the Jewish nation, right? So the first was the king. But one of the rules of the king is he was supposed to read and rewrite the law. And the reason for that is because the priests were going to make sure that this king understood that he's only king under God. So Israel had a theocracy, and that's what it looked like. But the secondary person that was supposed to be the counterbalance to the king was the high priest. The high priest was supposed to carry the religious life of the people, right? So the king was meant to make highways and have armies, but he was never allowed to go over into this area, which is the spiritual aspect of the nation. But there's a third, and the third was the prophet. And the prophet was beholden to nobody. They could walk into the king's throne, they could walk to the high priest and say, listen, God gave you a job and you're not doing it. And because of that, here's what's going to happen to you. So the prophet was a counterbalance to both of these. Throughout Israel's history, you know things are going bad when the king and the high priest both aren't doing what they're supposed to. This is how you know that power in this particular nation is now off the rails. This is why the prophets are so important. This is why many of the books of the Old Testament are named after prophets, because that was their role. They weren't beholden to the priest. They weren't beholden to the king. They just get to come out and say, by the way, this is what's important. I believe when we talk about prophecy today, people think of prophecy. I was having this great conversation about the book of Revelation early this morning today, and we were talking about it, and I was saying that one of the things people mistake at, when we look at the book of Revelations, Western commentators have particularly looked at this book and said, oh no, this is foretelling the future, and this is what's going to happen in the future. Wrong. But we've done that oftentimes when we look at the Bible. We say, oh, it's foretelling the future. The voice of prophecy, or prophecy in the Bible, is about seeing sin and calling it out. And I see that today, that piece is actually kind of, it's growing a little bit less and less. People don't want to offend. And again, please understand, I understand that instinct. But there's also this piece of us that says, okay, this is the line I can't cross. This is the piece I can't cross. Especially in the month we're in right now, right? Christians are now kind of like, okay, we're not going to say anything. And please hear me clearly, and just before you start freaking out, we live in a democracy. I am very much of a person who believes, live how you want to. It's not my problem. I, however, am called to something higher, something deeper. It's the law, the Bible, it's God. It's his revelation of the boundaries for humanity. And please, you, I, we don't attain to that, but that's the goal. To a king, to a person of power, these things then become negotiable. These rules are for the people, not for other ones. I remember having a conversation with the Wall Street Journal writer, and we were talking about just this disparity that's happening. This was about like 6 years ago now, 7 years ago. And we were talking about the disparity between like the ruling class and just the rest of people. And he said something that's so interesting, and I told him I'm totally going to rip him off, and I did, and I have. And he said this, he goes, I wish the people who are in charge would preach what they practice. I'm like, wait, what? He goes, so right now we're living in this time where people are saying, you live however you want. But the people who are up here are living like 1950s nuclear family, right? They're going to school, they're getting married, they're having kids, and they're having a job. And I'm like, why is that important? He goes, because we know there's 3 ways to avoid poverty. When we talk about poverty, everyone has these different ways of talking about poverty. I said, so what are these 3 ways of poverty? He goes, 1, don't get pregnant before you're married. Okay. 2, graduate high school. Okay. 3, get married. I'm like, that's it? Yeah, that's it. He goes, if you fulfill those 3 things, you will move to the middle class. I'm like, no, that's not. No, that's not what I've been told. I've been told that no matter what happens, you can, or this trying to press you, whatever. No. These 3 metrics are what we know will actually alleviate poverty. Because when you look at people who are in this level of poverty, whatever it looks like, they fall into these 3 categories. I'm like, whoa. Right? He says, I wish the people who are up here, they're telling everybody, hey, do whatever you want, live whatever you want, but we are kind of a classic nuclear family. That's what he said. I wish they would preach what they practice. Because they say to everybody else, no, it's no problem. This is all no problem. And please understand something. I know people, it doesn't matter which way you look at, you can struggle and you can do that, but you can be successful. It's no problem, right? But these are anomalies, not the norm. In general, we see how these statistics kind of bear out. And I haven't even gotten into addictions and mental health either. That's a whole different conversation. But the point is, power and how we look at it is important to how we view God. So there's 3 things I want to take away from Solomon's life and the second part of chapter 1. The first thing I want to say to you is position gives perspective. Now the reason I say this is because King Solomon's perspective shifts from the beginning of his career to the end of his career, well, probably middle of his career to the end of his career, to the point where God says to him, by the way, taking everything from you because you didn't remember what we talked about. When it comes to our lives, we need to examine our position because it is dictating our perspective. And most of us are seeing things from a position of limited understanding. We're only understanding things as we experience them, and our interpretation of our experiences is based upon limited knowledge or false knowledge. So think of this for a moment. If you're in school or you're recently graduated from school, your perspective of the world is this. In your 30s, it's this. In your 40s, it's this, and 50s and so on. You look back and it shifts. Now, why is this important? Because King Solomon forgot what was important at the very beginning. He says to God, God, I need wisdom because I don't know what I'm doing. And God's like, yeah, you don't, but let me help you with that. Abigail Dodd says it this way: instruction and boundaries were genuine and imperfect expressions of our love for our children. When we require children to do chores and study and practice instruments, we require the activities that make us for faithful, wise adults. And so it is with God. God's commands are expressions of love. So we think about God, when we think about God's commandments and we think of his boundaries, it's one of the things that's so remarkable to me. And as society shifts away from a Judeo-Christian understanding of the world, we realize that there are going to be consequences to that. And this is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a fracturing, a splintering of our culture, because now we're having different ways of viewing things in a way that doesn't make sense. So the God who created us said, hey, these are the boundaries I have for you. These are how you should treat one another. These are how you should live out your life and live up for the other people. And you go, okay. But now, not so much, right? Not so much. And Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5 to 8, it's really important. Because remember, the book of Deuteronomy is the world's longest sermon. And I know you think it's mine, but it's not. It's Deuteronomy, right? Moses is saying his last sermon to the people because he knows he can't go to the promised land. So he's just trying to say to them, remind them, remind them, remind them. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5 to 8. Look, I now teach you these decrees and regulations, just as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may obey them in the land you're about to enter and occupy. Obey them completely, and you will display your wisdom and intelligence amongst the surrounding nations. When they hear all these decrees, they will exclaim, how wise and prudent are the people of this great nation. For what great nation has a God as near to them as the Lord our God is near to us whenever we call on him? And what a great nation has decrees and regulations as righteous and fair as the body of instructions that I have given to you today. But watch out. Be careful never to forget what you yourself have seen. Do not let these memories escape from your mind as long as you live, and be sure to pass them on to your children and your grandchildren. Now, why is Moses saying this, and why is this important for King Solomon, and why is this important for the book of Ecclesiastes? What God tells us isn't just for right now. It's for the rest of our lives. Right? It's not about this idea of like, in this perspective, when I was a student, this is how I looked at the world. But now as I'm a young adult, this is how I look at the world. Now I'm an adult and a grandparent or whatever it might be. This is how I look at the world. And you go, okay, fair enough. However, through all those transitions of life, God remains the same. And the decrees he gives us remain the same as well. And so the reason why Moses said to the people, listen, you're about to go to the promised land, but please do not forget. And by the way, when do we forget most God's laws? In the time of plenty. In the time of pleasure. In the time of much. Right? When we are suffering, when we are hurting, we are as close to God as you've ever seen a person. But when we have what we think we need, we're good. That's when we negotiate. And the reason I say that is because King Solomon is ruling at the time of the most prosperity in Israel, but we ourselves are living at a time of great prosperity as well. You may not feel that, even though with inflation, you're still richer than most people in your world. And so the reason why the position gives us perspective is because it's reminding us that no matter where we are in life, how God asks us to live, the boundaries he gives to us, they don't change. Second thing, wisdom is greater than knowledge. Wisdom and knowledge have quite a bit in common. Both words are primarily used as nouns that are related to learning. They are listed as synonyms for one another in thesaurus.com, and in some cases may be used interchangeably, but there are some significant differences between the two. Knowledge is typically gained through books, Google, research, and having to delve into facts. Wisdom is typically gained from experience and acquired over time. A phrase I've used before: knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. Here's the point. I had this conversation. So I was in California a couple weeks ago for some training, and we had a education consultant down there who was going to give us a segment of that. And I just wanted to talk to this individual after the session because I wanted to ask a question. And the answer was kind of interesting because I've mentioned this before, but they reinforced it for me. I said to them, so in your opinion, as you look at education today, what do you think the greatest need is? And he's like, oh, that's actually an interesting question. I said, I know. And I said, so what do you think it is? He goes, well, here's the thing. About 20, 30 years ago, education was to give people information because they didn't have it. Right? So times tables, right? All this type of stuff, right? This is information you need. He goes, but here's the problem, is now we have access to every piece of information almost that's ever been written in history. And the problem is nobody knows what to do with it or knows what's greater than the other. So we all treat it equally, but it's not equal. So a blogger living in his mother's basement cannot be equal to a PhD, cannot be equal to the, we have to realize that sources of information, people speaking the information, there's different levels. He says, the problem is right now is kids just don't know how. They don't know how to sift through this, and this is what's creating this kind of discordant cognitive dissonance in our culture. So he says, what we need to do now is we need to have a secondary piece of education that talks about how we can sift through information and know which is more relevant, which isn't. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, right? Because when we think about this idea of knowledge, we have knowledge, right? Like, I'm going to fact check you. You get your phone out and, you Google the first thing, and, the first one that shows up is probably the one you want anyways, because the algorithm wants you to think that you're right. But is that actually the case? And this is what's interesting. And just so you know, Christians do this as well, too. Here's my verse. That's a great verse. But is that really what the verse is saying? Well, no, it's my verse. Well, okay, but it's a verse in a book, in a Bible, in a chapter, and all that. So let's take a look at the context. So what's interesting is we talk about this idea of wisdom and knowledge. King Solomon asks for wisdom. But I will say to you this, and I'm just going to throw it out there to you. I think in his humility, he understood why he needed it. But as pride grew, I think he discards it. And I think that's why you have the book of Ecclesiastes written the way it was. While wisdom does bring amazing benefits, it will also increase the burden of your heart. It will cause you to be aware of consequences and suffering that are to come for others, and this will weigh you down. This weight is not a bad thing. It is actually a good thing from the Lord. And I think that's absolutely true. So when King Solomon says, with all this knowledge comes grief, comes sadness, I think he's right. If you ever talk to somebody who's really smart, or not so much smart, but wise, there's always a sadness about them because no matter what they're talking about, they always see the consequences of it. They always go, okay, extrapolate out, like when you talk to people about, hey, how's culture doing? They're like, it's okay, we're okay. How's the environment? Well, it's okay, right? It's like, why? Because they have those information they know. It's like, okay, we have a lot of work to do, and the reality is no one wants to do it. So they have this sense of like, well, it's okay. But the more you learn, the more you realize how much work there is or how big the problem. I have a friend of mine who's in the government, works in the Canadian government. And I had messaged her the other day, a couple weeks ago, because I heard about this bill coming out, and I just I'm sure I'm not understanding this correctly. I'm sure I'm not getting this right. And she said to me, it's way worse than you can imagine. And I'm like, oh my goodness, thank you so much for that. That's going to make my day so much better. I appreciate that. And it's not, again, please understand, it's not the Canadian government. It's every government, right? It doesn't matter, right? But the point is this. I see this small piece, and I'm like, I'm kind of freaking out a little bit. She sees the entire legislature. She's like, oh, it's way worse than you can imagine. And I'm like, oh, spectacular. This is going to be fantastic. I can't wait for my grandchildren to grow up in this. But the point is this. When you think about this idea of wisdom, we have lots of people with knowledge. We have lots of people with Google. We have very few who are wise, know what to do with this information, how to apply it. And finally, I think the thing that King Solomon shows us the most is humility is the key for growth. Studies show that with more humility, those with more humility are better at assessing evidence, better at understanding those with different viewpoints, and more curious. In short, they tend to end up smarter and more successful, according to a bunch of experts, including Wharton professor Adam Grant and Harvard's Steven Pinker. Now, what I like about this is that not only do these individuals, but others have said it like completely. If you are teachable, you will learn. And if you learn, you'll always be growing. So Katie Lynn spoke to us a couple weeks ago about this idea of transformation, right? And she did a remarkable job in regards to her sermon series. But what she's really saying and what we really need to understand is transformation only takes place if you are aware of what needs to be transformed. I'm only aware of how much I don't know by how much I learn. The more I learn, the more I'm like, oh, I just have so much more to learn. The humility was what King Solomon had at the very beginning of his career. When God appears to him saying, what do you want? I just need wisdom. That was a humble leader starting out his career. The back of his mind is Bathsheba. Fast forward, how many years later? He's got 1,000 concubines and wives. He's the wealthiest king almost in history. And all of a sudden his perspective shifts. I needed God at the beginning when I was vulnerable. But when I'm established, when I'm wealthy, when I'm whatever, I don't need God anymore. I don't need to follow his decrees. His decrees are for the other people, not for me. My power, my wealth, my prestige, my wisdom, my knowledge, not for me. And we saw the consequences. James chapter 3, verse 13 and verse 17. If you are wise and understand God's way, prove it. By the way, I love that. Prove it. By living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. But the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It is also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. So if someone says to me, I'm wise, there's a resume for wise people. Let's just read that again. Wisdom from above is first of all pure. It's peace-loving, gentle at all times, willing to yield to others, is full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. I don't know if anybody who fits in all of that, but I do know this. Christianity could use a lot more of this. Like, we have lots of knowledge, but I don't think we have a lot of wisdom. Right? Wisdom says, again, as I said to you at the very beginning, we live in a democracy. We have people who live different ways, different religions, different beliefs. That's fine. That doesn't make us insecure. If someone says to me, I don't believe the Bible, I don't freak out. Go ahead, let's talk about that. I'd love to know why you believe that, and maybe I can help you understand a little bit more. Right? This is what I think. This is what Christianity needs to be. And I'm going to say this to you right now. We need more wise Christians. On social media, for sure, but everywhere else as well too. We just need wiser Christians. Just that acknowledges the fact that, there's different ways of looking at the world, different ways of living in the world. And that ours is one way. I believe that if we live according to what the Bible tells us, I think this is attractional. I believe that people will see it. I believe if we not preach what we practice, we've already been doing that, but practice what we preach, I think that people will go, oh, okay, there might be truth there. There might be something more there. And that's what I think is so interesting about King Solomon, and I think that's the great failure of King Solomon, is the humility he has at the very beginning is lost as he moves up in power. And again, there's chapter after chapter that talks about his wealth, his prestige. He has monarchs coming to him for advice. His wisdom is known throughout the land. And again, it puffs up. The humility he had at the beginning is gone. And he becomes unwise. So I asked this question at the beginning. Are you smart or are you wise? Being smart's easy. I know that may seem kind of a weird thing to say, but being smart's easy. Why? Because in your pocket, you have an electronic device with access to every piece of information in the world. If I say to you, who is the starting pitcher of the 1984 World Series champion? By the way, I don't know the answer. I just pick something out at random, a sport that I don't know anything about. But in about 5 seconds, you could Google that and you could find out for me, which is a remarkable piece of information. But the other question that I've asked about, are you a wise Christ follower? Are you full of mercy? And you know why I think wise people are merciful? Because wisdom and humility, in my mind, go hand in hand. The reason why a wise person is humble is because they know of how many times they've messed up. They know of how many faults they have. And that ability to look at somebody else and see them in their failure and not judge them in that failure, but extend towards them instead love and mercy, because they understand. It's that quote I use by C.S. Lewis. I forgive the unforgivable in others because God has forgiven the unforgivable in me. And that is 100% true. That is this may come as no surprise to you, but when I was in my early career as a pastor, I was very, I don't even want to say this word, but I was very judgmental. I thought I knew all the answers, got my degree, I could speak Greek, I got this, right? But then as you start interacting with people and you see their stories, and you see their paths, you see their journeys, and you realize, wow, God is so merciful and great. And this person who comes from this particular background or this broken relationship or made this mistake or and you realize that God can redeem and move and change and transform and it doesn't matter if they come from a good family or a bad family or they were this or they were that they can become something more. You just go, okay, Lord, I don't know anymore. Just do your way. Just have your way. And I think what changed in my mind as a pastor, as a minister, it's just encountering more and more people like this. And just beginning, you know what? And so I shifted in how I chose leaders. I shifted in how I chose people to be in positions of prominence. It wasn't about what family they came from. It didn't matter how many years they were in church. I tell this story of Scotty Burton. He's a real friend. He's a real guy. You go on my Instagram, you'll find him. Okay? When I was at my previous church, Scotty Burton walked into our youth group that night. He was high. I didn't know that. Well, bloodshot eyes. I did know that. And he was like, he was like, I used to go to church many years ago, whatever. And he's like, but I'm just checking this whole church thing out and came out to here and whatever. And so he came. That was the beginning. Then he sat through the worship and the teaching, and then afterwards, he wanted to talk to me, right? And so we had this conversation and we talked. And that weekend, we were going on our youth retreat. I said, Scotty, come on the youth retreat. I don't have the money. Scotty, come to the youth retreat. I don't care about that. What is it? We're going to go away. And I always, when it was youth pastor, we're going to go zip lining and rock. Oh, okay, yeah, that sounds fun, right? They don't talk about the other stuff, right? We're going to have worship services and teaching that are going to pound you to the dust. But I'm not going to tell him that yet, but it happened. By the end of the retreat, he's crying. He's just, the Holy Spirit got a hold of this kid like you wouldn't believe. Last session, he says to me, I don't know what's going on. I'm like, I know what's going on. You're going to become a youth leader for me. He's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, dude, you're going to be a youth leader for me. Next week, you're going to come into my youth discipleship training course. You're going to be a youth leader for me. I was high when I came to your youth group on Thursday. I'm like, I know. We all knew, buddy. Trust me. You reeked of marijuana. We knew that, right? That's no problem, right? But for some reason, the Lord just spoke to me that this kid has something more. Well, he comes to our youth group as a leader, and he doesn't know what he's doing. This kid looks so lost. It was hilarious, actually. And I know that Brock knows who I'm talking about, so he'll remember that. He'll remember Scotty that way as well, too. But he was lost, but he was kind of this big guy. He's kind of lovable, whatever. But then after that first Thursday as a leader, I said to him, you know what, Scotty? I think God wants you to be a pastor. I don't know why I said it. It just struck me as I'm sitting there preaching, and I see him like, oh my gosh, this guy's going to be a pastor. Freaked him right out. What are you talking about? I'm like 4 days sober. I'm like, dude, I'm telling you right now, God's got a call in your life. You need to go to Bible college. But think about it. When I say pray about it or think about it, just so you know, I know the answer. I'm just waiting for people to catch up. That's not always true, though. I want to throw it out there because some people look at me in the church and like, ah. Okay. Sure enough, Scotty goes through, and by the way, he was one of my best leaders. And he goes to Bible college, and he graduates Bible college. He's youth pastor right now. He gets a message from me I get a message from him every so often on Insta. I'm like, hey, he's got his beautiful wife. He's got kids now, and he's a youth pastor at church. And it's like, yeah. But please understand something. Not me. It's just that when I see people like Scotty, I realize he doesn't fit the mold of what I think a Christian should be or what I think a pastor should be. Like, I can think of so many people that think to themselves, well, you know, I'm just, you know, whatever I am in my life. God would never use me or do anything through me. The thing that I thought was interesting with Scotty was that he was humble because he really knew what he didn't know, and he didn't know anything. Like, this kid was about as bright as a bag of hammers. He was not smart at all, right? But he worked. He worked really, really hard. And school for him was very hard. Like, he almost dropped out of high school. School was very hard for him. Right? Writing papers and theology and all that was difficult. But he did it. Just by effort. Right? Just by effort, he did it. I tell you the story about Scotty Burton. By the way, he's a real guy. Because a lot of pastors make up stories about people who don't actually exist. And I just want you to know, you go on my Insta page, you'll find him. He's there. What I think is interesting about, are you smart or are you wise? Smart people are people who can access information. Wise people are people who might have more relational wisdom, who might have more experience behind them. But I will say this, have buckets of mercy. A wise person sees somebody and doesn't judge them based upon their exterior or what they've accomplished or not accomplished, but sees what God can do in them. And I think that the church needs more wise people who can look at the world and not see the labels they have, not see the exterior, but realize that the Spirit can do something more. I think that's what's missing. Let me close. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. Again, a famous passage, but I love what Paul says here. Yet when I'm among mature believers, I do not speak with words of wisdom, but not the kind of wisdom that belongs to this world or to the rulers of this world who are soon forgotten. No, the wisdom we speak of is a mystery of God, his plan that was previously hidden, even though he made it for our ultimate glory before the world began. When we tell you these things, we do not use words that come from human wisdom. Instead, we speak words given to us by the Spirit, using the Spirit's words and explain spiritual truths. I love what Paul does here to the church in Corinth, right? We've talked about Corinth, so I don't need to go too much into it, but the church of Corinth was living in Las Vegas, the Middle Ages, ancient world Las Vegas, right? So indulgences of flesh and money and wealth and power and all the kind of freaky deaky stuff that we think is happening today, it was in Corinth times 100. So the book of Corinthians is actually a really great book, the first and second one, because it's dealing with this kind of people. But what Paul does at the very beginning, it says this, listen, we're going to talk about wisdom, but the world's view of wisdom is very different than how God views wisdom. See, the world's view of wisdom is you come from a prominent family, you have all these talents, you're good looking, you're this, you're that. Yeah, we can use you. God's wisdom is, you know what? I'm going to take a Scotty Burton. I'm going to take a Roger Stone. I'm going to take, insert your name here, and I'm going to do something with them. Now, only if they're willing, and certainly only if they're humble. To be teachable is to be discipled. To be discipled is to be transformed. And to be transformed is to mature and grow in faith. That's it. Every one of you sitting here, whether you're sitting here right now or watching this at a later date, you think God can't do anything with you. You think that, I'm just going to church, I'm okay. I just need you to understand something. In the school of the Spirit, we use supernatural wisdom. And that is, God sees you, not as you are, but as you could be, in the potential of how you exist. Don't care about your background. Don't care how much you've messed up. I don't care if you messed up yesterday even. If Scotty came my youth group high, and now he's a youth pastor, and again, I use Scotty as an example, but there are so many people I have been privileged to partner with. And again, the only weird thing about me, I see potential where other people don't. I would make people leaders that would be like, what the heck are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. I just see this person. I just see this person. I think when we stand around the throne room of God, we're going to see people in that throne room going, that person? Really? They're standing here, but B, they were faithful? Really? God's like, yeah. In the school of the Spirit, in the supernatural wisdom, God sees the potential. God sees what you could be now as you are. Doesn't see your past and certainly does not see your mistakes now or in the future. All that's part of transformation. Let's pray. Heads bowed, eyes closed. Worship team's going to come on back up. King Solomon starts his career with humility. Asks God for the greatest thing he could ask, I need wisdom. He forgets about that humility. He forgets about that, and he becomes proud. He becomes arrogant, and he becomes wealthy and powerful, and he forgets. I just want you to know something. No matter who you are, no matter what stage of life you're in, be teachable. Let the Holy Spirit teach you. Grow. And please, please, please hear me very clearly. I don't care what age or I don't care what stage you are in. God is not done with you. He's not done with you. I refuse to believe that the creator of the universe called you to be a Christ follower just so you don't go to hell. God's called you to something more, something beautiful, something profound. And yes, it's messy, and yes, you're going to make mistakes, and yes, you're going to fail, and yes, you're going to fall. That is all part of transformation. That's all part of discipleship. That does not negate your inclusion in the kingdom. It does not negate your inclusion into what God has for you. And you're much better off if you're younger to learn this now. But if you're older, you can still learn it now. God is not done with you. Dear Lord Jesus, I thank you that when you look at us, you don't see us as we are, but as we could be. Holy Spirit, we had a definition of what wisdom was. It was pure. It was merciful. It was full of good deeds. It doesn't show favoritism. Lord, that kind of wisdom I need. That kind of wisdom we need. That's the kind of wisdom that that Christianity today needs. Christ followers who are wise, who are merciful, who show how their lives live out what they believe. And I pray, Lord Jesus, in this room, that each one of us would be teachable, would grow in you, and not allow the limitations of this world, of our past, of our present, dictate what the Spirit can do in and through, and of course, despite us. Lord, I love you for the fact that you look at me, you look at us, and you have mercy. You call us to something beautiful and profound, and I pray in Jesus' name that we would continue to move towards that. Sometimes crawling, sometimes running, maybe just even standing still, but Lord, I pray we'd always be in the direction that you have called us to. I ask these things in Jesus' name.